Good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Burke, and I am Deputy Head of the Arndt Department of Economics here at the Crawford School of Public Policy, and I am also the convener for the H.W. Arndt Lecture Series. I would very much like to welcome ADB President Takehiko Nakao to Canberra, and also the whole ADB delegation as well. The land on which Canberra lies has long been a meeting and gathering place, and I commence by acknowledging and celebrating the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and paying respects to their elders and also the emerging members of the Ngunnawal community. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the 2019 H.W. Arndt Lecture. The lecture recognises and celebrates the contribution of Professor Heinz Arndt and his 50 years of service as Professor and Emeritus Professor of Economics at the Australian National University. Professor Arndt made a major contribution to intellectual life in this country. At the ANU, among his many contributions was the pioneering establishment of the Indonesia Project in 1965, and his work on the Indonesian economy and Asian economies more generally, for which the ANU is internationally renowned. Professor Arndt was the founding editor of the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies and was also an editor of Asian Pacific Economic Literature, two economics journals which are edited from here in the department. One announcement is that President Nakao's slides have been uploaded to the event page on the Crawford School website for everyone to download and to have a look at and to keep. So thank you very much, President Nakao, for allowing us to do that. Hosting this year's Arndt Lecture will be the Chancellor of the Australian National University, Professor the Honourable Gareth Evans, AC, QC. Professor Evans took up his appointment as Chancellor of the Australian National University at the start of 2010. The Chancellor has a very long bio, including receiving a Companion of the Order of Australia, AC, in 2012 for his eminent service to international relations, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, as an advisor to governments on global policy matters, to conflict prevention and resolution, and to arms control and disarmament. Chancellor, I invite you to the podium.
Well, thanks very much, Paul, for the kind introduction, and welcome to you all. I'm absolutely delighted, both as ANU Chancellor and as a very strong supporter of our university's engagement in major public policy issues, to be hosting this 2019 H.W. Arndt Lecture here at the Crawford School of Public Policy. Every great university, as I've often said, is characterised not only by the quality of its research and teaching, but also the quality of the contribution it makes in other ways to the wider community, local, national, and indeed global. And I, for one, have never been in any doubt that ANU's particular value added in this respect, a direct function of our history and our location here in the national capital, has been and will remain our contribution to national and international public policy development. It's also been, I have to say, as many of you will know, a core part of my own vision for public policy at ANU, that the Crawford School of Public Policy within the College of Asia and the Pacific be the most visible focal point for that activity, making us, we hope, eventually the functional equivalent of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Within the Crawford School, the Arndt Cordon Department of Economics, founded as a direct unit all the way back 1962, has always been our most prominent and respected, one of our most prominent and respected flagship centres, working as it does, as you all know, on theoretical and applied problems of international economics and development, with an emphasis on the economies of Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Southwest Pacific. The department was, of course, named after Professors H.W. Arndt and Max Corden, who both played really crucial formative roles in the department's intellectual history. Max Corden, known worldwide, particularly for his work on trade protection theory and international monetary systems, and Heinz Arndt, for whom this lecture specifically honours, and whose personal legacy we do indeed very warmly and particularly acknowledge here today, being, as you would know and as you've just heard, best known in Asia and particularly Indonesia for his work as a development economist, contributing enormously to our understanding of the region and the region's understanding of itself. Since its establishment over 7 decades ago, ANU has had in all its research and teaching and public policy outreach a very strong priority focus on the Asia Pacific, with the Arndt Corden Department, the Crawford School and the College of Asia and Pacific all driving aspects of Australia's engagement with and understanding of our neighbourhood. And that focus becoming ever more intense and relevant as we all grapple now with the opportunities and challenges presented to us by the Asian century, including particular challenges still of poverty reduction and, of course, climate change. As one very recent example of our focus on the Asia Pacific, the university is invested in a multi-year grand challenge project, Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific, which is looking at ways to harness the potential of renewable energy throughout the whole region. Economic growth is vital for improving living standards in the Asia Pacific, but there's much more to it than that, in the sense that trade tensions, environmental issues, are themselves creating major risks to economic growth. Having high-level discussions on these great issues, which we'll pick up now today, is the Crawford School's business, and who better to lead us in today's discussion than this year's H.W. Arndt lecturer, Mr. Takehiko Nakao, President of the Asian Development Bank, Chairman of ADB's Board of Directors. Mr. Nakao was elected President by the ADB's Board of Governors and assumed office in April 2013. Before joining the ADB, he was the Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs within the Ministry of Finance of Japan. In a career spanning more than 3 decades, Mr. Nakao has gained really very extensive experience in international finance and development. His senior positions in the Japanese Finance Ministry, which he joined back in 1978, include being Director General of the International Bureau, where he fostered close ties with leading figures in the Asia-Pacific region and the G20 countries. He was assigned as Minister at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. between 2005-2007, and from 1994 to 97 served as an economist and advisor for the International Monetary Fund. He's published books, numerous papers on financial and economic issues, and in 2010-11 was visiting professor at the University of Tokyo. I'm very much looking forward, as we all are, to hearing ADB President Nakao's delivery of the 2019 Arndt Lecture, and I have pleasure now in inviting him to the lectern. Mr. Nakao.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans, and I'm really honored and pleased to be here and to speak to you. I remember I came here several years ago, before I became president, but I should have checked my notebook myself, but maybe it was the time I was Vice Minister of Finance, and I made a lecture at that moment. The world is still evolving and more than expected by many people. And of course, the Australian economy has been, I would say, fortunate or because of your good policies, but the country has enjoyed the economic growth more than 20 years now without recession, and the second quarter of this year was also positive, so it is not a recession. There was a small negative in the previous quarter, but the recession is usually defined as 2 consecutive negative growth of quarters. So it is, when I look at the Australian economy it is a combination of a resource-based economy, but also based on the intellectual kind of the service, including education and also high-end tourism. And now per capita GDP is very high and comparable to the United States. So that is about Australian economy. But of course, there will be challenges, especially because of the Chinese slowdown. And before, previously I came here to make a lecture, but also when I attended a meeting in Sydney, maybe 10 years ago, I should have checked my notebook again. But at that moment, the main focus of discussion in the business community seminar in Sydney about 10 years ago, the main focus was when the Chinese economy starts slowing down, and it is now happening, and it is now having impact on the Australian economy. So there is such a change, and also, of course, there has been the efforts to recover from the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2009, and there are so many issues regarding how monetary policy can address the difficult issues of a very low growth and very low inflation rate, and sometimes zero bound interest rate. So these are things we are facing, and there are many other issues, I would say geopolitical issues or issues related to the sovereignty or the global system, like the Brexit, and also the discussions in EU system about how to treat the immigrants, and also the issues of how to keep a Euro system stronger, because in 2012 we saw very major crisis of sovereign debt in countries like Greece, or Spain was also on the verge of going to the IMF. Italy was difficult, so Euro system is also challenged. Although the currency is unified and monetary policy is unified to a large extent, fiscal policy is totally different. So there is no serious support by the fiscal policies to support banking sector when it is crisis. So although there is no exchange rate movements between countries because of euro, still the yield or the interest rate of a government bond can differ very much. So the attack comes to not to the foreign exchange market, but to the government bond market, and people start selling the government bond, and the interest comes high, and it is more difficult to re-roll the government debt. So these are about European countries. And in America, of course, the Trump administration's policies is different from others in many ways, especially the resorting to the trade kind of the measures to address many issues. And it causes confusion. That is one. But at the same time, China's emergence as a big power and the kind of difference between the perception between the Chinese people or Chinese leadership about themselves, in essence, which is China is a developing country, still developing countries, and the support to other countries is South cooperation instead of support from developed countries to the developing countries. So they are not part of OECD Development Assistance Committee, OECD DAC. So there are so many rules in the OECD regarding the ODA loan should be untied. It's not tied to the procurement from the country, for instance. And there are many rules about how interest rates should be set and so on, how to manage the over-lending to countries. So China's policy, although even if it is from goodwill, it is causing some difficulties in borrowing countries, and there is too much influence from China. So, of course, the population itself is 1.4 billion population, and it's the largest. India can be now growing over China, but the China's economy is now 2/3 of American economy, and still Chinese leadership and people regard itself a developing country, but it's not anymore the ordinary developing country. It's a great industrial power, great innovator, and great power in many regards, including cultures and also the army, military powers, economic powers, financial powers, military powers, and in many regards, it has a very large influence. So there is a gap when China says they want to industrialize the economy. There is a clear target for 2025 industrialization, manufacturing manufacturing 2025, and there is a clear target of, in a sense, exceeding the American economic power or the industries by 2050. So when they say that it is now causing a kind of the kind of uncertainty or concern among countries, including the United States and other countries. So I think China's issue is, of course, there are countries which are regarding China as a kind of more, more like a rival, but at the same time, China's policies and perception about themselves are now inviting some concerns. I have regular meetings with the Minister of Finance twice a year at least, or 3 times a year, and sometimes even higher leadership like a Prime Minister. And I have a very good feeling about China because of its success in post-war period, including poverty reductions, its success as economic power. And I know many things about China because of education in Japan. And during high school days, I could tell all the founders of dynasties and all the big poets of Tang dynasties and so on. I can still say, at least refer to some words of Confucius. So it is strange that when I'm asked, what is your motto? I sometimes refer to the Confucius saying instead of Japanese classics. Because like Latin, I think when we talk about classics, it is more about Chinese civilizations in case of Japan. I think the same to some extent to Australia, to some Western countries. They refer to Latin because it's a classic. So, by the way, I'm sorry to deviate from main line, but when I was asked by the interviewer, what is my motto? I said, the first sentence of Confucius' collections of words, that is, to learn and come back to those ideas from time to time, to relearn those things, it's a joy. And when friends come from abroad, it's also pleasure. So I said often this to students. There are not so many students. There are maybe OBs or OGs of the schools, but we learn at school, and I appreciate those things after we graduate from school. When we were at school, we just learned, and I think it's a burden. But after we graduate, I think we value those kind of subjects which we learn in schools even more. That's at least my essence. So what I want to say is, in short, I respect the Chinese cultures, but I hope that China would also coordinate with the international kind of ideas and norms. And it's not just a norm, but it's about perception. China is now a very huge power in the world, and they should understand why the other peoples are more interested in their policies. So I already mentioned several things more generally, but I quickly look at what the ADB is doing, and then I'll have some time for Q&A. So this is the coverage of countries and 49 regional economies. And New Zealand, Australia, Japan's were from 1966 founding members. They were meeting in New Zealand to establish ADB, and Australia was also very important supporter of funding of ADB in 1966. Now we have 49 economies, and many of them are from the Pacific Island countries. And Niue last year joined because its closeness to New Zealand and also that some diplomacy is taken care by the New Zealand, but we decided to include Niue. And there are non-regional countries here in the bottom. But those are countries over Europe, Canada, America, and Turkey is part of non-regional members, which cannot borrow from us. It's just supporting us. And the difference between AIIB and ADB is AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing, is has a membership of about 100. It is still growing, including African countries, Middle Eastern countries, Latin American countries, and so on. It is becoming more like the World Bank instead of Asian Development Bank. But our idea is to concentrate, focus on Asian development and the Asian regional members, which is defined by the SCAP of the United States, United Nations. So it's up to Iran, although Iran didn't join ADB. But anyway, it doesn't include many non-regional countries which are not the traditional, developed countries to support these regions. So Australia has a very strong interest in Pacific Island countries. And I'll see the treasurer and the minister for Pacific and international development this afternoon. And maybe the main focus of discussion can be about how Australia and ADB can cooperate to support these Pacific Island countries. By the way, we are in Manila, and why Manila is chosen as the headquarters of ADB, and Mr. Macaulay, the scholar in this school, wrote a book with a lot of help from our staff, and I read it, and I knew it briefly, but this book really depicts well with, about each decade of ADB history, ADB's development, as well as the functions of Asian Development Bank. And there was a vote of 18 regional members, including Australia. But at that moment, 18, so on the first vote, Japan took 8. So it's still short of 9, which is a kind of majority. And Tehran took 4, and Manila took 3. And in the third vote, the second vote, Thailand, Bangkok, and Kuala Lumpur, and what else? Singapore took 1 each. And then in the second vote, Manila go over Tehran. And then the third vote, Manila took 9, and Japan was still 8. So it was the reasons Japan missed the chance, although Japan is the biggest shareholders with the United States. But anyway, Manila was a good place because it's more closer to the center of the area, and it's developing countries, so give a sense of the developing countries. By the way, at that moment, the China was not a member. China was a socialist country, and the Taipei China, then Republic of China, was a member of ADB, and Hong Kong China. But and India didn't borrow from ADB because India was too big to borrow, and so India was taken care by the World Bank. But in 1986, after China became member of IMF and World Bank, they also wanted to come to ADB. But at that moment, President Fujioka seriously discussed with China's central bank governor, then it was a woman governor, several times, many times, and with the help of Deng Xiaoping's ideas, Taipei China was kept with the name of Taipei China as a different membership. So Taipei China is now part of the Korean executive director's consciency, 12 consciency, and Taipei China is part of a Korean consciency. So I think it was a really interesting move because APEC and other international system kept the similar traditions of keeping Taipei China as a separate membership. So if we can look at the country data, there are of course differences, and China is now GDP of about 14 trillion or 13 plus something, and the United States is now becoming even larger to 20 trillion. So every time I look at these ones, I'm amazed by the very strong continued growth of China as well as the United States. And Japan is 5 trillion, almost 20 years. So because of the lower growth, but it is because more people are aging. So the out of the population, working age population is shrinking, and population itself is declining, and the inflation rate is about 0, and the exchange rate is stable. So it means that there is no growth in the nominal GDP, and it's a pity, isn't it? But in a sense, Japan still keeps this level of GDP, even if the working people is shrinking. So the shrink of a working population itself has a population demographic onus, demographic burden of 0.9% per capita. So if, unless there is a growth from capital investment and also total factor productivity, it will go to the negative. So just to keep the level of economy in the Japanese case is a kind of achievement. So working population is the productivity is gaining, but because of a shrinking working population, it is now shrinking. But in case of Australia, in a sense, because of the growing population and also the resource boom, it is still continuing to a large extent. And now per capita GDP is about 40% more than that of Japan. So it's interesting. So Japan is about 40, and New Zealand is about 40, and I think UK and France are similar to Japan, 40, and Germany is a little bit more than that. So even among developed countries, Australia and the United States are, in a sense, a front runner. And once again, China's per capita GDP is also growing very fast, and Korea is now closer to Japan in terms of per capita GDP. So it's very interesting to see these numbers every year. And Indonesia is also growing, and Philippines is also growing. And these countries have a very large population. Australia knows those things very well. Indonesia has a population of about 265 million, and Bangladesh 100, and Philippines, Vietnam, and these countries also have about population of about 100 million. So Southeast Asian countries overall has a population of 650, and it's already much bigger than EU, and it is now becoming a very important part of the world economy. Although there is a lot of discussion about secular stagnations of very slow growth in the world economy, Asia, developing Asia, as I said, it is 49 member countries minus New Zealand, Japan, and Australia. These countries are still growing at the pace of 5.5% or 6%. If it can grow at the pace of 6%, in 12 years, it reaches double of the per capita GDP. So 5.6% is already high enough. And if we exclude needs, we should exclude needs. Needs is a Korea, newly industrialized economies, Taipei, China, Korea, Hong Kong, China, and Singapore. If we exclude it, it's more than 6%. So in 6%, it can grow at double in 12 years. It's a large number, isn't it? So of course, developed countries are slow, but Australia is still growing. And 2019 can be slower, but it depends on the coming quarters. So it can be slower, but compared to the developed countries, it is growing very solidly. But developing countries, of course, it is slowing down. So slowing down is not an exception to Asia, but before Asian financial crisis, it was growing at a very high pace, close to 10%, because of very large size of a Chinese economy and also growth rate of China. So anyway, this is slowing down, but still, what I emphasize is not slowing down, keeping a solid growth even after global financial crisis. And China, there are many reasons. PRC, by the way, is the People's Republic of China. And there are several kind of reasons. One is cyclical and excess capacity, and there is too much leveraging financial activities, so they try to deleverage, moderate it. But at the same time, structural factors, they have invested a lot. So it's a very resource-based growth. So they import a lot of iron ore and coal. So they are now, China is now shifting more toward more environmentally friendly, and also more consumption-based, more service-based economy. And the declining working age population will start having a negative impact on Chinese economy. So if China can continue to grow by the pace of 6% per annum, it's a surprise to me. So in this level of the industrializations, the development stage, it's very difficult to keep the pace of 6% per annum. They can still, because it's the difference between the developed countries and China is still 1 to 4, 1 to 6. So they can still grow faster, but I don't know to what extent they can continue. So if we look at the China again, consumption share of GDP is lower than that of the developed countries. In developed countries, it is at least 60 or 70%. But so China still has a space to grow based on the consumption. And agriculture is already a smaller portion of GDP, but industry is very large. So service sector can grow. So service sector, it's a kind of a measure to GDP, but if women in the household go out and start buying and start working and start buying McDonald's hamburger, even if the welfare in terms of eating and so on is the same, the GDP grow. So GDP is a market-based measurement of economic activity. So there are serious questions about to what extent we can capture the welfare of the people of the Google, Wikipedias, and Facebook, and so on, because many services are free, although those companies still charge certain fee to advertisement when they use their data. So some part of these activities are captured as a GDP, but not all compared to the welfare we get from these services. Anyway, what I want to say is that China can still grow based on the service sector and consumption. which I talked seriously with Mr. Igang of the People's Bank of China's governor. I have known him for more than 10 years, and since I was vice minister. And when I talked with him, he mentioned the service sector of China can be underestimated because of a lot of informal activities. So if they capture those things to the GDP number can be even greater. Anyway, and about the Pacific, there are more vulnerabilities of Pacific Island countries, and especially the it is too small to see, but there are some disasters which hit these countries more often. Landslide is less problem, but this orange one, this is storm. This is a storm impact. So Pacific has a more storm impact. And the flood and landslide is smaller because many countries are not so mountainous except Papua New Guinea and so on. And this is earthquake and tsunami, so this yellow one. So it's also susceptible to tsunami. So this is more detailed discussions about the Pacific. This is about sustainable tourism discussions. And if we look at, I don't know whether we included Australia in this one or not. We discussed these issues at the time of Fiji meeting, and we should have included Australia, because Australia also earns tourist receipts of GDP. And it's a very important sector as well as the education sector. And if we look at this one, you can tell that in Fiji, tourism receipt is 25% to 24% of GDP, or even more. And in the last year, there is also statistics like about 38% of GDP is a tourist receipt. But when I discussed this issue, the finance minister of Fiji, he mentioned, Mr. Kayumi mentioned that for tourist receipt, they also must import a lot. So I have a perception that the tourism sector is more labor intensive and can have a more value added. But at the same time, tourist needs a lot of import. So in case, according to Mr. Kayumi, I haven't checked it, but in case of Caribbean countries, the only 2 to 5% of receipt is their own value added, because they must depend on the hotel chains, the global hotel chains, and they must import the orange juice, beef, and everything from abroad. And also even Philippine workers and other workers. In case of Australia, I suspect that the value added from a receipt is much more, because Australia can produce most of the things. So it depends. But this is becoming very important part of the economic activity, it's for sure. And there is a growing number of the visitors. And once again, I should have asked to include Australia, but in case of China, 60 million people arrived in China compared to, this population is very large, so tourist to population ratio is about 5%. Yes, 5%. In Thailand, it's a very big tourist to population ratio, and Japan also is becoming a tourist spot. This is 2017, but 2018 it was like 32 million. So it's dramatic increase for Japanese tourism. It was about 10 million just 8 years ago, but it is now 32, so about 4 times as much, including a lot of tourists from Australia. So why do I pay attention to this? Because it's becoming very important industry for Pacific Island countries, and also even countries like Australia, Japan, and so on. And the reasons, another reasons I'm looking at this one is because if there was a discussion, if we have AI and robotics, there will be a lot of job loss. And one ADB paper looks at that one. But our conclusion is there are too much talk about the job loss. And the job loss can occur, but not as much as people are worried. The reason is, first, not all tasks the human do cannot be replaced by the machine. And the second, even if it is feasible, like sewing machine to produce something, clothes, even if it is technologically, scientifically possible, it's too expensive to do that by machine. And the third reason is if we produce more by the efficiency of our productivities, there is more demand. When there was a steam engine, steam trains, people were worried about loss of jobs because of horse-related activities. But of course, there was a much more demand based on the convenience of trains. When automobiles was first invented, it was more regarded for leisure for rich people. But automobile automation made the society totally different, and there is a lot of demand from that. So even if there is some productivity gains, we can use the higher income for consuming more of services and products. And also, in addition, if there is some loss of jobs in some sectors, there are more works coming, and the new works coming, like the programming is already old, but there are new works related to cyber securities and so on, our AI-related work itself. And I now find so many coaches and trainers and so on. So in many countries, executives hire a coach trainer to ensure that they can learn full marathon 41 or something. So there was no such works previously. So because of affluence, because of more productivity, we can enjoy more trainers and coaches and so on, which were not really necessarily regarded necessarily in the previous time. So what I want to say is that tourism is one of them. So we should not regard this just a marginal industry. It is becoming very important industry, especially in the island countries. Oh, by the way, but at the same time, we should think about how to make tourism more sustainable, because too many people coming cause trouble to traffic, and prices of houses and services and products in the cities, and also the kind of disruptions of community, because there are too many tourists, and also there are too many hotels in the community. So in Kyoto, in Barcelona, and Venice, and so on, this becomes a very serious issue. Buses are always occupied by the foreigners, temples are all full, and so on. So we should think about how to have a kind of the reasonable guidelines, standards, or even the regulations. Why do we have so many tourist industry today? Because of low-cost carriers, and also the policies to give more visas easily, and also because of higher income by the emerging economy. That is the most important. And also the social media. If we look at the good pictures of places by social media, if we look at the delicious looking food, we want to try real things instead of just looking at the social media. So, and also it's easier to make a reservation to take tickets and so on. So I think tourism will continue to increase. So I don't spend too much time, but the ordinary capital resources, that is a base of voting share, and Australia is fifth biggest shareholders after Japan, US, China, and India. And Asian Development Fund, which is concessional loans and grant. Until 2016, it was grant and concessional loans, but after that, we made it only for grant by merging the existing capital to the ordinary capital resources. So concession lending is now from ordinary capital resources. So by that, we can use leverage. By issuing bond, we can also finance concession lending. But anyway, Japan is the biggest contributor to this ADF, but Australia is also the third biggest donor. And international staff, there are so many Australian staff. This is the equities and the lending outstanding and so on. So the ordinary capital resource is now 51, but before the merger, it was only below 20 billion, but because of the merger of combinations with the concession loan program, we have now much larger equity. So equity to loan ratio is near the 50%. So there is a space to grow without capital increase. And we are continuing to increase our lending in terms of annual commitment. When I came, it was like 14. Now it is more like 22 billion. By the way, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank lending last year was, I should have brought the material, but it is $3 to $4 billion, $3 or $4 billion. Yeah, so compared to the AIB, we lend a lot. By the way, I have a very good friendship with Mr. Jin, the president of AIB, and I have met him at least 10 times after the AIB was established in 2016. And because he was the vice president of ADB and he knows ADB very well, so we are co-financing together at least 6 now, and we are also discussing many common issues as multilateral development banks. We are still lending a lot to energy, but this energy is mostly about renewable energies and transmission line using smart transmission, smart ideas about transmissions, using more efficient transmission lines and better technologies. Transport is also, by the way, renewable and the transmission to support renewable. Renewable includes solar, geothermal in such countries in Indonesia, and sometimes wind, but solar is the most important one. Transport is also important because of a large public transport station like railway, but also subways. We support subways in India and now, and also Vietnam and Indonesia and so on. But agriculture is still important because we now face, once again, food security issues, and because of the environmental issues, I mean climate issues, we face more heat and shortage of water and so on. So irrigation is still important. And water project is about urban waters, and in Dhaka and in Phnom Penh and so on, we build a new water system using better technologies, including district management system instead of without districts to monitor the leakage and collections of tariff and so on, better involving communities. So water is important. Finance is SME finance, and sometimes especially more attention to women's business. And the public sector is also important to support the budget to do some reforms. China is still large borrower, but the World Bank did it, and we are now thinking to making lending to China more limited or smaller in amount, but focused on the issues like environment, climate change, and other issues related to the externality, positive externality to neighboring countries. As I said, China is already big economic power, and there is less support to continue to lend to China. But I still believe by engaging China through ADB regarding renewables and solid waste to energy and so on, we can still support them. And also our lending to these countries, China and India, is not concessional. We are charging our funding cost by issuing bond plus premium. So the lending to China and others is a source of our budget. We don't require the budget support from countries, but we need a certain spread to earn our administrative costs. But anyway, our lending will, to China will be maybe smaller in coming years, but with a focused agenda. So we are, these are sovereign and non-sovereign. Non-sovereign is lending to private companies, private equities, and so on, without government guarantee. SOE lending to state-owned enterprises with government guarantees regarded as sovereign, but we are now increasing our lending to private sector without the government guarantee. And it promotes the private activities more generally. And also co-financing, like countries like Australia, or Japan, Korea, and so on, is also important. And we also co-finance with the Green Climate Fund of in Korea. That is now major instrument to support the climate change in countries. This is a chart of our system, and there are many kind of departments to ensure the safeguard policies for climate change or environmental protection, social protection, and so on, legal office, and so on, and anti-corruption and integration. Operation departments, five regional departments, plus the private sector operation, but there are so many departments to ensure good work of us. And we are now paying more attention to sector and thematics groups, because if it is divided by the region, there is no integrations of technologies or new building of technologies and partnership with the institutions in the world, including such a school like Crawford, because public sector governance is a very important part of our work. And why we are still demanded by the countries, they can already finance their project by issuing bond. They need some foreign exchange, some countries, but they also want to see, learn from us about how to manage the public finance and so on. So that is part of our value added. But anyway, we are now trying to be more innovation-oriented institution, because very simple vanilla type of the support is not really appreciated by the countries, because once again, they have now money. In 1966, many countries was a very serious current account deficit plus foreign exchange shortage. Saving is a shortage, and also foreign exchange is not enough under the Bretton Woods system. So they need money, but today they have money in a sense. So unless we can provide better knowledge and technologies, unless we can combine good knowledge and technologies with our finance, we wouldn't be appreciated. There will be no demand for us. So to keep ADB as a relevant institution, we should pay attention to these issues. By the way, poverty came down a lot, $1.9 per day for persons measure Merkmal. The poverty, absolute poverty in Asia is already 264 million, which is 7%. Compared to 1990, the gain is obvious. But if we look at 3.9 per day, it is still about 1.1 billion. 30% of Asia population is still under poverty. So there are still many things to do. So we issued a strategy 2030 last year, and there are many elements. And we have these targets. The poverty still important, and gender equality in Asia especially, this is important for economic growth, but also for social welfare. There are many potentials coming from women's participation in the workforce and in other activities. And climate change and disaster resilience and management, and the environmental issues, including the ocean health. And the cities is becoming more urbanizations, and there are more city problems. And rural development and agriculture is still important because of a growing population in some countries, and rural and urban divide. And strengthening governance and institution is still key. And also regional cooperation. ADB itself is, I'm always saying that ADB itself is created as a kind of instrument for enhancing regional cooperation, but we are also supporting Pacific, Central Asia, Greater Mekong sub-region, and South Asia through the sub-regions initiatives. And we are also discussing importance of key approaches. There are many targets regarding climate change and gender, and also there should be private sector. Yeah, there is a target here. So we have set several clear numerical targets for these issues. And also, we must make ourselves more efficient and effective in many ways, including human resource management with more mobility, more strict or effective evaluation system of the peoples. This is Asian century, so Asia will become about half of GDP by 2050. It can be earlier or later, but it is growing in this way. And this is not by us, but it's by the Commission, the report by Emerging Forum. But one caution is that, yeah, Asia was regarded more than 6% of GDP by early 19th centuries, before the Industrial Revolution, because of population of India and China, and also their productivity was not as different from Europe, maybe 1/4. Regarding China, it is regarded by Madison that China's productivity is 1/4 of Europe, around 1800. But the population was very larger, and India had a large population. By the way, at that moment, Japan's population was 30 million, and the China was maybe 300 million or 250. And Japan's productivity was half of Europe, but because of population, China's was much more important. And it is now recovering. But it is very natural to have such a 50%. Because the population itself is more than 50% of the world. So on average, the Asia can be 50%, but it depends on the definitions of Asia. So what I'm saying is Asia shouldn't be too proud or complacent. Still, in many ways, Western civilizations still have a prevailing impact. Since at least the 15th or 16th centuries, Western countries innovated many ideas like a joint stock companies, insurance, and of course Asia had such an element, but the commercial law and the law governing sovereign states, patent law, and these institutions were mostly invented by European countries. So in addition to science and technologies, which surpassed the level of Asia in 15 or 16, Europe provided, or European related countries provided a lot of soft power, software institutions in the world. So it's not so easy to make Asia the dominant force of the world, although it doesn't mean that every good thing about the human history comes from the West. Asia also has a very good tradition of paying attention to human rights and also women's rights, and also about the technologies and the kind of scientific thinking. By the way, in addition to this book, I don't know whether you can read it, but we are now writing a new book about Asia's development history itself, and Professor Hill is helping us. But we are writing this by our research department, and I'm also spending huge time, especially during the summertime, and it starts from the dynamics of structural transformation from agriculture to industry to service. So, but there are so many kinds of service today, so how do we evaluate it? And agriculture, starting from Green Revolution, there are many, progress, and the agriculture population is done smaller, which makes the peoples can be engaged in the industry and the service. So agriculture productivity gain was the first of the development. And technology progress is a key. So there was a discussion by Professor Krugman that Asia doesn't have a productivity gain, but it's really untrue. It was 1990s discussions, and resource mobilization itself is very successful by having a good population, good labor, plus a good capital, which many other regions like Africa are not successful. So, and infrastructure development, water, and so on, we discussed those things. And also gender and climate change is added. So I hope that you'll take a look at this one after we publish in the next spring. So I already spoke too much, and less time for Q and answers, and Mr. Evans looks a little bit worried. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, President Nakao, for that extraordinarily wide-ranging presentation, which you've told us an enormous amount about the ADB's operations, structure, priorities. You've addressed, at least in passing, some of the issues which we're very interested in, like poverty reduction and environmental strategies for the future. And you've spent a lot of time talking about a country that's not a member of the organisation, but China, which we're all, of course, deeply interested in. Lots of hard questions, I think, still to be asked and answered about Asia's economic future and the role of the bank in promoting it. So we now have 20 minutes or so for questions from the audience, which, if you could just identify yourselves before we put them directly to the President. So, who would like to go first? Yeah. We've got roving mics, have we? Ken, is it? Mr. Bull?
Maybe I'll start.
Okay, there we go, we're working.
Ken Bolden, Director of the Grand Challenge Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific at ANU. So very interested to see your breakdown of investment by the ADB by sector in various areas, particularly energy, where it looks like roughly a quarter of investment in total is in that area where you mentioned the investment in renewables. What I'm interested in, though, is the decarbonisation investment in other sectors. For example, electrification of the transport sector, low-carbon farming practices in agriculture, these sort of things. Do you report against the decarbonisation investment that you're making, and can you give us some rough idea of the total percentage in that sort of general area of decarbonisation?
Thank you very much. So decarbonization is one of our very important agendas for the world and for us. But about our energy production, electricity productions, our idea is we are not supporting the coal fossil-based the electricity anymore. And the last project was in Pakistan in Jamshoro project. So. But at the same time, for some countries, sometimes super critical or very efficient coal is the only option to give the access to the electricity for the large population. So at this moment, we don't totally deny the possibility of a coal-based or the fossil-based electricity production, but we are staying away from that at this moment. And also decarbonization more generally, as you said, we are supporting more public transportation based on the electricity, but electricity production needs some energy. And at this moment, in any countries, renewable is not 100%. Even in Germany, which is boasting renewable, about 30% of electricity is from coal. So, but we should go toward that directions, and we can do it because of a lower cost of renewable these days and better batteries and so on. And as you said, in electricity, about the transport, we are supporting public transport, but we try to make it even more energy efficient. And also the energy used for the agriculture is also very important. So how to save energy to produce something, and also how to save water. So drip irrigation, the water is coming to the root part of the vegetables and so on to avoid the loss of water by evaporation. We are supporting those ideas. So, and also satellite image to have a better irrigations. So we should use more digital technology and other technology to save energy, to make more toward the decarbonization, toward more water saving and more environmental protection.
Thank you. Yeah.
My name is Mehdi Kronkel from NIDA Graduate University in Bangkok, currently visiting ANU and U of Canberra. About 20 years ago, ADB championed a development of the area in Southeast Asia called Growth Triangle, and also the Greater Mekong Sub-region, GMS. I want to know, from your perspective of the president of ADB, what are the status of this development now, today? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have been supporting several very important sub-region projects, and Growth Triangle, including Indonesia, Philippines, and BIMP-IGA. There are several. BIMP-IGA is Brunei, Indonesia, Philippines, and also there is another small project including Malaysia and Indonesia and so on. We also supporting ASEAN itself, and also GMS is Greater Mekong Sub-region, including Thailand and Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and also the Yunnan province of China. So we started this GMS when we saw the kind of the transitions of these Indo-China economies to more market-oriented system in 1990s, and also it was about 10 years after the conflict in Cambodia. So Greater Mekong Sub-region initiative was very important to make these countries connected even after the Soviet system was collapsed. In Central Asia, we also support CAREC, Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation, CAREC, for Central Asian countries, and also including Pakistan. And once again, this is to support the connectivity by transport, energy, and water, and others between these countries after the collapse of the Soviet system. So without centrally control the Soviet system, they I mean, in a sense, the connectivity was lost. So we supported these ideas. So today we are supporting, and also South Asia, we have a similar approach. Because South Asia, one of the reasons of slow growth of South Asia was the connectivity between countries was less than in Southeast Asia. So value chain is not that developed in South Asia. So we are trying to support it. So it is, we started in 1990s, and still we are doing this. And it is written very well in this book.
Yeah, at the back.
I am Igor Skrябin from ANU Energy Change Institute. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And as we can see, we are a university audience, and many researchers and students in this room would probably be interested to know, do you collaborate with universities, and how do you work with university? And if you do, on what principles, and how university innovation and research can contribute into your objectives?
Yeah, as I briefly touched on the issues, the universities, both in technology, engineering part, but also in this kind of the governance and the public administration's side, we can collaborate, and we sometimes get trainees, and we have seminars, and we commission some works to the universities when it is necessary. And also we have a scholarship program with the universities. As I said in the beginning by citing the Confucius idea, learning and studying is so important part of our development. So universities, although some universities don't have as much money as the platform companies, but they still provide a very important contribution to the world, including to our work.
Okay. Was there a question up the back? If not, down the front here, please.
Lee Kang-soo from ANU. Thank you so much for your very informative talk. I have two questions. The first one is about AIIB and ADB. You mentioned about 3 to 4 billions from AIIB and 21 billions from ADB. You also mentioned about there are 6 joint projects. As you know, there's a lot of worries about debt financing, along the One Belt One Road. Perhaps AIIB is one of them. So in those issues, on these issues, is ADB aware of those debt financing issues? And in your doing joint projects, will ADB using the expertise, the capacities of financing to help AIIB for the third world investment? That's my first question. The second question, I'm very glad to see ADB still continue to support education, strengthening the education services and human capital investment. I wonder, we are actually Arndt Cotton, I'm head of Arndt Cotton department. I'd like to use the opportunity to thank ADB for the long-time sponsorship in terms of scholarship. So many students from a developing country, regional economy, benefit from the ADB scholarship, together with Australian government sponsorship and World Bank. So we hope that can continue in the future. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. About AIB and ADB, again, from the beginning, we have supported the AIB's foundation very much, including how to write charter or the treaty, and how our legal office works relating to the private sector contract and other issues. And also we shared a lot of information about what we call safeguard policies, about environmental protections and also social protection, such as resettlement of the people when we have some works like including hydropower projects. So we share those things, and I have a regular meetings with the Mr. Jin, and I visited his office, he visited my office, and he made a lecture to our staff, and I made a lecture to his staff. So, and we are co-financing, but at the same time, we should pay a serious attention to debt issues of countries. AIB is not lending too much. The debt issues is caused more by the Export-Import Bank of China and Development Bank of China. Those are Chinese public financial institutions, and those are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So AIB is not the agency for Belt and Road Initiative. That's what Mr. Jin clearly stated. But at the same time, because Belt and Road Initiative wants to be more international institution, they wanted to bring in the AIB as a kind of a secretariat to the BRI. But the BRI is a very big project, and the ADB can work with the BRI initiative as appropriate. But I'm a little bit more cautious about BRI because it's lending too much. So the AIB, the international institutions, and Australia, Canada, and US and Japan are not members, but many European members and Australia, Canada are members. So it is managed very carefully. I think we should distinguish these two. But about the scholarship, we are supporting scholarship, and especially Australia and Japan made a huge contribution to scholarship program. But Japan is under very serious fiscal conditions, so there can be some decrease of scholarship, especially to countries outside Japan. But I hope that they'll continue to do so at least. And Australia can also support because of more space of fiscal and economic power.
I'm not letting you off the hook yet. I just want to ask you a question of my own about ADB-AIIB relationship. I'm delighted to hear, as we all are, that the relationship is one of sweetness and light and total complementarity. But isn't there also a pretty sharp competitive edge to your institutional relationship?
Very good questions. But generally speaking, AIB is more about the financial modality, and ADB is more with the knowledge and the kind of experiences. AIB has, at this moment, about 200 staff, but we have about 3,500 staff. In a sense, too many staff. It's very costly. But the AIB has a smaller staff, and it is increasing, but they don't have resident missions. They don't support concessional operations. They don't go to the social sectors like health and education. They don't do the policy-based lending, which is a budget support that combined with the policy matrix. So we need a more detailed kind of operations, and they can co-finance. So it is complementary, but there is a serious competitive edge at the ADB because of experiences, because of staff, and because of knowledge, and the development of policies and the concessional and social sectors. So I have a feeling of a rivalry to the World Bank. When the World Bank regards itself as superior to ADB, I instantly contest it. Especially in Asia, we have a lot of knowledge, and our lending capacity now is similar to that of the World Bank. The World Bank also must take care of Africa and other regions. So as far as Asia is concerned, ADB is as big as the World Bank. And in a sense, we are regarded nicer, less preachy. You don't, please don't quote my remark. But we are we are more modest, and we try to learn from countries, and that is the remark by Mr. Watanabe. We should try to hear from countries' experiences, country experts, before starting preaching or telling what to do. So that kind of the legacy is still at the ADB.
Time for just a couple more questions.
Can you ask some women to make questions, because there is no gender balance so far. So
Well, that's true. You've got any
no
gender balance still? No question here.
Well, I'm very sorry that I'm not wearing a dress.
It's not a problem. Yeah.
My name is Ross McLeod. I'm from the Indonesia project in the Arndt Department of Economics. Amongst the various information you've given us about the ADB's focus, there was quite a strong emphasis on poverty and inequality. We're all very familiar with policies that are designed to make people less poor, but if we specify inequality as a separate concern over and above our concern about poverty, then that seems to me necessarily to imply that we're concerned about people being too well off. And so I wonder if you could tell me what policies the ADB supports to make well-off people less well-off.
It's a very important question, and there is no clear solution at this point. Poverty reductions, we have made a lot of progress in Asia. There is less poverty, as I mentioned, but the inequality is now increasing in developed countries and also in developing countries. And it is because of the technologies, and it is because of globalizations. They benefit generally more skilled people, more educated people, more than less skilled people. Especially in developed countries, it is serious. But even in developing countries, like in Philippines, there is a wide gap between the poor and rich, and it is not shrinking. Because sometimes when there is a more globalizations, more export and import and foreign direct investment, the foreign partners must have a partners in their countries. They are often rich people and privileged people. So in many countries, it is widening. In China, it is widening. And we discussed these issues very carefully in this new book, the Inequality and the Poverty Reduction. The message is poverty reduction is progressing, but inequality is increasing. And to take care of it, we need more things to do, like redistributions of income, like inheritance tax and property tax and so on, or progressive income tax. But people move between countries, they move to Singapore and so on. So it's not so easy to charge a higher tax in the individual income tax. So in my idea, I was in the tax bureau for 6 years. So my idea is to have a value-added tax and to use it for public education, public health, and so on to support poorer people. So expenditure side is more important, but to do that, we need a certain revenue to use for those purposes. But it's not the ADB's role. But when I'm asked a question, I always say that we need to have enough revenues to support the infrastructure for poor communities and for supporting poorer families for education and health. That is the most important element.
Okay, last couple of questions there and then up the back, unless we can do something to redress the gender balance. Oh, okay.
Okay,
sure.
okay.
Okay, well,
Two questions.
It's got to be more aggressive.
Two questions, yes.
Okay, but this gentleman here first and then. No, okay.
Oh yeah, thank you for the opportunity. On the fact that Asia's share will be like 50% of the global economy in 2050, just wonder if it is only about China and India. So what ADB will do to balance the economy within Asia? That's number one. That's number two is that we see that the structure of Asian economy has been changed a lot within Asia. Some countries actually growing much faster. However, if I look at the role of each of this country within ADB, it hasn't changed much. Will that be the relatively stickiness of role of each country within ADB actually a constraint for ADB in supporting Asia growth?
You are talking about shares?
About share, about, yeah.
Okay. So we can get the whole question together. Yeah.
Yeah, so. We'll take 2 or 3 questions now and do them together.
Right. I just have a non-economic question, so I just want to discuss further about the role of China. So it seems in Western media, the perception is China is aiming for world dominance, but then according to you, it seems that they're still trying to take approach of, developing countries still need support. So in your opinion, what kind of approach should China take? Thank you.
Okay, and I think the lady behind you also had a question. Did you also have a question? No?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
My name is Batkiril. I came from Mongolia, and I'm an ADB student. So the role example of what you discussed about supporting the education in developing countries. So taking this opportunity, I would like to express my gratitude for the ADB, because it was really hard to find a scholarship, because I have a huge ambition to develop my country in terms of poverty reduction, environment sustainability, and economic issues, and so far. So here at the Crawford, I'm gaining a lot of knowledge, like privileged knowledge. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. And one last question from the gentleman who has been waiting for a while, and we'll finish with that.
I'm a student at Crawford studying economics. So I'm from India. So I just want to ask that since you showed the statistics of the GDP growth of the Asian economies, last semester we were being taught that many of the Asian economies which have a growth rate of more than 7% are engaged in the middle income trap. So has ADB developed any strategy or planning to develop any strategy to get this?
Can you speak a little bit slowly and also closer to the microphone, please? Yeah.
Okay, so has ADB developed any strategy or developing any strategy plan to help these countries get out of the middle income trap, the Asian economies, which are growing at around 6% per annum, but they are not able to get out of the middle income trap.
Middle income trap, okay.
So has ADB developed any strategy for that? And my second question is, since ADB is promoting green technology and green energy resources, so does ADB plan to give conditional loans to countries so that they can shift to, so that countries can shift to greener technology, which is quite expensive till date? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. There are many questions, so quickly, I hope that I can cover all the discussions. About China and India, Asia's growth is not just about China and India, of course. As I said, Southeast Asian country, ASEAN itself is 650 million people, about half the size of China and India. So they are growing very solidly, and many people are now communicating through English. And I think although ASEAN people themselves don't really appreciate it, but I think the ASEAN, which was created for, in a sense, resisting to the communist influence, today now include Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, 10 countries, and it provides a very good platform to continue the market-oriented reforms and the economic integrations through trade and FDI. And also it is a platform to include China, Korea, Japan, ASEAN plus 3 or ASEAN plus 6, including Australia, India, and New Zealand. So ASEAN has a great chance. And other countries like Bangladesh is growing very steadily. I met Prime Minister Hasina, and she is so happy to see the women's education is now improving a lot. Generally speaking, in Asian developing countries, the women's education year was shorter than boys before, but it is now more than boys in many countries because it's worth investing in girls. So Bangladesh is growing very fast. And Vietnam and Myanmar, these are the ASEAN countries, but not just China, India, to be sure. And about the shares of the contributions of ADB, unless there is a capital increase, there is no change of the shares of voting and capital contribution. So over time it can change, but we are based more about the convergence of ideas and not necessarily consensus, but we don't decide things just by the number of voting. So I think the influence of smaller economies is very large. And Indonesia and Malaysia and the Philippines and Australia, they have a chair. So it's not just by these numbers. And about China, once again, what I really want to emphasize is that China, if they still continue to look at China as developing countries, and if they can behave more like a developing country to cause the trouble. That is my idea. So. And also, they must think more seriously about how they are looked from abroad, including some actions related to geopolitical issues. So, China, if China continues to be taking attitude of a more, moderate, open-minded, liberal, and based on the cooperation, from their eye, maybe. Chinese leadership, it is a champion of the free trade, champion of supporting poorer countries, champion of regional cooperation, and champion of climate change. But from the outside, it's not always look like that way. So they should understand it, and otherwise, the global community has been very supportive of China. Australia has been very supportive since 1978, when Japan had a friendship treaty with China. Japan supported a huge amount of money through the concessional lending. So international community has been very supportive to China. So as far as China is acting as a responsible, there was an idea of a responsible stakeholder. It was the idea by American senior official. But anyway, if China continues to play a responsible role in a kind of ideas of coordination, friendship, and modesty, no one would try to check it. But if they want to show off that China can regain the power again over early 19th century and try to recover from humiliations of 150 years of humiliations after the Opium War and China-Sino War and others, it would cause a trouble. Because the world today is different from early 19th centuries. Not any countries in the developed countries have now ideas of imperialistic or materialistic kind of expansion. So of course China knows it. So I think still the idea that they are still developing countries, smaller influential country, is not correct. It is already superpower, equivalent to the United States to some extent, in some extent. They should understand it. About education, of course, it's very important, and I'm happy that your scholarship is used very well, and you come to this meeting. And we are supporting secondary education and technical and vocational education training in countries like Cambodia, Laos, and the Bangladesh. That's why Prime Minister Hasina is so happy because of our support. About India, and the middle income trap, India has so many issues still, including sanitation, toilets. And when Prime Minister Modi was launched, one of his initiative was to give a toilet for all people. So 30% of population didn't have toilets. So it causes a lot of trouble for girls to attend schools and so on. So now he's moving to the water for everyone, drinking water for everyone, and also water conservation and so on. I met Prime Minister Modi last week and had a 1 hour discussion. So he's so interested in how to use technologies, how to use the new ideas. But so middle income trap, it was a case for Latin America. So Argentina, for instance, was one of the most developed rich countries in the world in the early 20th century, but they are still in the middle income. So I don't know whether it can be applied to the Asia or not. But instead of worrying about middle income trap, continue to invest in good infrastructure, good investment, good the income policy, I mean the redistributions of income and so on. If we can continue to do that, you don't need to worry about the middle income trap. If we have a basis, countries can continue to grow. That is my belief. And finally, clean technology. We are supporting once again clean technologies, sometimes using concession loans. And we are also providing policy-based lending to support policy changes in the upstream level, like nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. We are supporting these policies, especially for smaller countries like Pacific Island countries. So we are trying to do that.
Well, this is a conversation we could obviously continue for a very long time because the issues you've raised in your original presentation and addressed in your very comprehensive replies to questions are issues of immense objective importance and of immense interest to us all here today. But we have now run out of time, so it remains only for me to thank you very warmly for having the pleasure and privilege of you being in Australia, having the pleasure and privilege particularly of you honouring the legacy of Heinz Arndt by addressing the Arndt annual Arndt lecture, department's annual lecture here at the Crawford School. It's been an enormous privilege for me to have the honour of hosting you here today, and I'd like, on behalf of you all, to offer this small token of our appreciation and ask you to join with me in thanking President Nakao.